Hello everybody, my name is Komon and welcome to another Genshin Invokation TCG video. Today I'm going to be showing you what I think are the best decks within version 5.8, at least so far, as we're only about 2 weeks into the patch, but I highly doubt we're going to discover any new meta-shifting decks, as the new cards have been pretty underwhelming. Now what isn't underwhelming, however, is the current best deck that also happens to be the previous best deck. I have no idea how it wasn't nerfed, and that is Crab. For those of you who may not be familiar as to why Crab is so good, it is basically just better than you. All of its skills are just higher value than anything you could ever imagine. Sitlali, as you may be familiar, is just has one of the best skills in the entire game, just at least value-wise. She deals 2 cryo damage at the very least and gives you 2 shields at the very least, but that can go up to anywhere to 4 damage and 4 shields if you give her enough Night Soul and you give her a Night Soul at the right time. Oftentimes it is going to be 2 cryo and 4 shields, which in Crab's case becomes 8 shields, making it so that a lot of the time you're going to have a 3 cost 10 value skill, which if you think about it is more value even than Diluc or Wanderer, who have to not only work to get to their bursts but also oftentimes overkill, so they waste some of the value on their skills, whereas Setlali gives it in the form of shields mostly, which are always going to be valuable. Now, unfortunately, her skill is only usable once every 2 rounds, so we're going to need something a little more spammable, and thankfully we have Candace for that, whose skill gives you 2 shields to Crab and deals 3 damage, so it's basically a vanilla skill that also gives you 2 shields to Crab. On top of that, we have Crab's skill, obviously, that gives 2 shields and deals 2 damage, which is ironically the worst value skill in this deck, but you're still going to be using it pretty often just to get that energy to get to Crab Burst, which is obviously the big payoff for building all of those shields. On top of that, the Burst and Candace's skill are both prepare skills, which lets you use Fruits of Training to do even more skills as this reduces their cost. On top of that, this specific list made by Kevin Z that beat me in the first week of this patch's weeklies is specifically made to do as many skills as possible. It has Gilded, it has Fish and Chips with Judong even, so it's basically a free way to get 3 extra dice to do skills with. On top of that, we have other foods like Sing Your Heart Out and Mystique Soup, which can also help you get either extra value out of your skills by dealing extra damage or lets you swap around easier. All in all, this is just a pretty standard mid-range good cards kind of pile where you want to just do as many skills as possible. This is not like what you would expect Crab to be, where it just sits on 3 millilith all game and just ramps up shields up until a point where you can't catch up with it. This is not that kind of stall-esque gameplay. This is more so mid-range, and as with every other good mid-range deck, it is just better than you. It has about as much damage as you, as well as having a lot more shields. This deck can oftentimes get up to like 30 shields in a game, which, when you think about it, is basically as if after you kill your opponent's team, they tag in an extra 3 characters, which, as you can imagine, is pretty ridiculous. This deck is basically the thing to beat in this patch, and it is pretty hard to beat. Now, a deck people have been bringing to beat Crab is Whale. The reason why is because, as I mentioned, Crab is no longer really built as a slower stall deck. It's no longer trying to play the long game, whereas Whale can play it. It has theoretically infinite value, with Jaska giving you infinite bullets and Forest Blessing giving you infinite tune fodder, making it so that as long as you trigger just like 1 or 2 elemental reactions around, you're gonna have cards that you can tune to then be able to skill every single round at least once or twice, or sometimes even refresh your burst with those skills, discarding Chaska bullets, giving you some extra damage. With Whale skill already dealing 4, Chaska's bullets can possibly make it 5. With reactions, it can be even more. Obviously, it allows you to even freeze with Setlali. Now, I know a lot of people are running Lila, but I'm gonna be real with you, you should be running Setlali. You should be running Lila if you are in a tournament where you have to bring multiple decks and your characters cannot repeat. Setlali is just honestly straight up better than Lila because, yes, theoretically, Lila throughout the course of the game, even after she's dead, could give you infinite value, but I'm gonna be honest with you, that infinite value is oftentimes just straight up worse than Citlali's. Lila's skill, if it procs, needs to proc like 4 times to give you as much as a, good Citlali skill. It's not worth it. It's really not worth it. And you might be thinking to yourself, no, but Lila gives damage where Citlali gives shields, but that is just wrong. As long as you have applied some like Hydro to your opponents, Citlali is gonna deal Cryo, and then reapply Cryo. She also deals damage, and then on top of that, this is not a deck that needs Lila's off-field or infinite Cryo application, as it has Chaska bullets to give you Cryo, as you are going to be sitting on one character and ramping for 1, sometimes even 2 rounds. So you're just going to be sitting on Citlali, you're going to use her skill, you're going to just ramp as much as possible until you get to the point where you can safely stay on Crab, until you've tuned enough cards for it to get a bunch of max HP, until you've gathered enough Cryo bullets, until you've put Tenacity of the Millilith on it. For the most part, this deck is just trying to make Crab as big as possible, and Citlali makes it pretty safe to do so, as its biggest issue is that in the early game it's doing right about nothing. So it's pretty not squishy, but it's pretty easy to exploit a lot of the time. Now, thankfully, a lot of the threats that were previously here to beat it are no longer really here, which is to say all of the Mavuika and Kachina aggro decks are not going to be around as much because they got slightly nerfed and Crab didn't get any changes and Crab naturally beat them anyway. So it is a little bit better of an idea to bring Whale compared to last patch. I still would not recommend it, but this is what a lot of people are bringing to beat Crab, so it's probably not the worst idea ever, It's probably good enough. Now, you might be seeing a little bit of a pattern here, a little bit of a repeat offender, and Citlali is kind of what makes all of the best decks kind of better than everybody else, because she is better than everybody else. She is what makes Crab so good. She is what pushes, Whale over the top. Now, I did mention that in Whale you could replace her with Lila, but I do think it is worse. Here, you kind of can't replace her. I know some people have been replacing her with like Hu Tao and with Frost Operative, but I highly disagree with that choice. Now, you might note that this deck was possible to be built last patch, just not with Lanyan. So if Citlali is so important, then why did I not mention it last patch? And it's because you kind of do need Lanyan, ironically. As much as Citlali is important for survivability, you do need a little bit more, and Jianyun did not provide it, whereas Lanyan is basically a version of Jianyun that gives you basically one less reaction, but gives you some more defensive utility, which you would take any day of the week, because this deck is already doing a lot of reactions. You don't really need to do more, and you would take the defensive utility over them, especially a spammable skill, one that is slightly worse value than Citlali, yes, but it is spammable. That is why people have been taking the leap to replace Citlali, because you already have a spammable shield skill, so they're assuming they already have enough defenses, but I would argue that's not the case. You could replace Citlali with someone like Hu Tao if you're thinking that you're going to be up against a lot of like slower matchups where you are going to need the value of a high damaging burst that Hu Tao has, if you think you're going to need to run like right for reward and stuff. But I would argue that Kuki with a weapon and with her talent is oftentimes going to be enough damage in those longer games. The way the deck operates, for those of you who are not familiar, is just using Kuki skill in the beginning of the game to apply some Electro, swirl it with Lanyan or Superconduct with Citlali. Then Citlali is gonna, replace that aura with a Cryo aura as she reapplies the element. Then you can swirl that, and you're just doing a bunch of reactions, getting a bunch of shields and a bunch of healing in the process, and utilizing good value cards like Veterans and like Mao. And then in longer matchup, in stolier kind of longer game matchups, you can utilize Aquila Favonia, Cookie Talent, and other stuff like that to basically outvalue your opponent. Now we're getting to the section of this video that I would call just a bunch of decks that deal a lot of damage. That's what their purpose is within this metagame, really. It's just decks that have the necessary amount of damage to go through Crab's shields. I'm not saying it's a good matchup necessarily, but it is definitely a playable one for all of these decks. Starting off with Clorinde, who, even though Mavuika was nerfed, she doesn't really care about it, as oftentimes you are going to be able to set up very similar situations. You use Mavuika's skill on 3, or 4-3 on 1. Round 1, you just use your skill, then equip Clorinde with like a Tenacity the Millilith. Maybe you play like a Wagner, and then on round 2, you can play out the weapon, and you just start doing stuff on Clorinde. It's pretty straightforward. It's like every single other Clorinde deck you've seen before. The nerfs didn't really hurt it that much, and in fact, it got a little bit of a buff in the form of Edict of Absolution, being able to last 2 rounds, as freeze can sometimes be a problem to a deck that is focused on one character. Now, this specific list was brought by Silky, I believe like literally yesterday or something, and I basically have no disagreements with it, so I would recommend you run this one. Maybe you can change like 1 or 2 foods, maybe like you can remove the extreme if you don't like it, but all in all, it's a pretty standard Clorinde list. You just go on Clorinde, you equip her with a bunch of stuff, and you use her as a carry that can deal enough damage to break through Crab. That's basically the whole idea of the deck. Now here's another similar deck that is once again here to do as much damage as possible in order to break through Crab. This is just Yunjin. Now I know there's also Hu Tao and Jelon in here, but Yunjin is the star of the show, as usual. Especially with Edict of Absolution now, lasting for 2 rounds, making it so that basically any freeze deck can't stop you, as Yunjin can most definitely kill your entire team in 2 rounds. Sometimes even in 1, but sometimes she does take those 2. Sometimes she does need a little bit more time, and you know, because she already has shields from her skill and she has a little bit of healing now from this, she is oftentimes going to be safe while she is doing her combo. And someone like Crab can't really bother her, even though Crab does have a freeze. You do have the Edict of Absolution. You do have the damage necessary to kill Crab, even past a bunch of shields. So this is once again another choice that can beat Crab in the right circumstance. This is another choice that just has the necessary damage output, and that's all. That's about it. That's all the damage the deck is here for. It's just to deal a bunch of damage. Now here's the most questionable out of all of the high damage choices. I'm specifically noting this one because China seems to love it a lot. Even last patch, when they weren't playing a lot of Crab, for some reason they were still running a lot of this deck. I still don't understand why, because this deck kind of just falls apart if you kill Bennett, but I guess now we don't have as many traffic lights or as many burning decks running around to kill your Bennett, so I guess it is a little bit better now. We also have like Edict of Absolution now, making Cube, you know, unfreezable. Previously, freezing was a bit of a issue, as it does prepare 3 skills. You know, that's a little too much time given to your opponent to freeze you or to stop you in any way or to overload you or whatever. Now, notably, this deck can overload you, so Edict of Absolution does hurt it a little bit, but oftentimes it won't matter. Won't matter. You're just here to buff the cube with Bennett and just make it deal a bunch of damage. Once again, this is another deck that deals enough damage to break through Crab. And this is another deck that's probably just going to lose to Traffic Light, but unfortunately, for some reason, they decided to nerf all of the aggro decks and not the one deck that stopped them. Now, even though I did mention this deck getting nerfed, and this deck getting nerfed pretty much out of relevance, a lot of people have stopped playing it, I do still have to mention that it is not as unplayable as people make it out to be. A lot of people pretend like this deck is dead now just because it lost 1 point of damage, and 1 cost on Mavuika, when in reality that was never really the deck strength. The deck strength was the fact that it can utilize Kachina so well, with Kachina stacking Kenichi's grapple, which the grapple was not nerfed as that, and that is the best part of his kid. It also utilizes like Mavuka's passive so well that you don't really care about it being nerfed to 3. You are still willing to pay that price, then discard that bike with conductors, then do a bunch of like crystallizes and a bunch of burnings, and do a bunch of grapple links. The damage output of the deck was not nerfed that much. It was in the first 1 or 2 rounds, you're probably gonna lose like probably like 3 damage, I want to say, but you're already running, you're already doing like 20 damage or like even more than that a lot of the time. So the deck isn't that much worse, but it did notably lose some of its damage output and some of its consistency, as now you have to pay 3 instead of 2 Pyro for Mavuika at the start of your setup. So the deck is worse, but it is not as bad as people have been saying, because I feel like a lot of people have this impression that this deck is entirely dead now, when in reality it's doing like the exact same things it was before. It's still losing to Crab, it's still probably beating Whale, and it's still probably beating a lot of other combo decks like that Cube deck, but it's not as good. So I guess I wouldn't recommend playing it over a lot of these other decks, especially because it doesn't beat Crab. But you can play it. It is an option. Don't let me stop you from playing it if you do want to play it. It is definitely a worthwhile choice. It is not that much worse. So you can run it. It's not the worst thing ever. So yeah. Now I do also have to mention Wriomiya, as somebody did recently top a weekly with it as well, and it is another deck that has the damage output necessary to deal with Crab, and honestly a deck that can also deal with Whale pretty well. However, I personally am not a big fan of it, and maybe I'm just a bad pilot of the deck, but you know, it does have the damage output. If this is another deck that you're familiar with and you want to play, it is absolutely an option. This is one of those decks that can deal enough damage to break through Crab. It is not the terrible matchup. I would still obviously recommend you just play Crab, but this is an option. It is worth talking about it, and if you want to play it, you absolutely could. So that's gonna do it for this video. I know it was a bit shorter than the last one. A lot of this did just kind of revolve around Crab. Like, Crab is so good, this deck has enough damage to beat Crab. That's about it. But honestly, that is really what this metagame is about. We have just a bunch of like good value mid-range piles that utilize stuff like Sitlali and like Lanyan to get entirely too many defenses while not lacking much on offense. And we're gonna need some decks to break through them. That's about it. There's not much else to the metagame. Now, as much as I am talking about how powerful Crab is, it is not unbeatable. As I said, there are multiple decks that do have the damage output necessary to break through it. However, as I noted, Crab also has a pretty decent amount of damage itself, so it is not like previous versions of Crab where you, as long as you had the damage, it kind of just died. It does also have a threat itself. It is also a threat itself, so it is not as easy to break through it just by having a lot of damage. So those decks are still not something I would recommend. Again, if you want to win, you probably should just be bringing Crab, but the gap isn't that big. This is not like a tier 0 meta. It's not like the only thing you can play, but it is pretty much kind of, in a way, the only thing you could play. You know what I mean? Anyway, that's enough for the video. Bye bye.